Hello, everybody, and welcome to the channel. So today we are having a discussion on the role of violence in fantasy literature, and I'm joined by two wonderful people here. So if you will just shortly introduce yourself, perhaps.
I guess I'll go first, maybe. So
Yeah.
I'm Philip Chase, and I run a BookTube channel called Philip Chase. Very creative name, and it's really exciting for me to be here for this discussion because I'm a huge fan of fantasy. I have started to publish my own fantasy, and the topic of in fantasy is something that I've been thinking about actually for a while. And so when you came up with this proposal to discuss the role of violence in fantasy, I thought, yes, absolutely, this is a topic that needs to be talked about more, because I think we all just sort of tend to just accept that it's part of the genre without reflecting necessarily too much on it and
Yeah.
how it works, what it does, why it's there, what can be done with it. So I'm really excited to have this discussion with you and with Varsha.
Yeah. Okay. If you tell us very quickly who you are, what you do, Varsha.
Uh, Hi, I'm Varsha. I have a tiny YouTube channel called Reading by the Rainy Mountain. It's been somewhat dormantish for a few months, but I have some plans for it for when I come back from vacation. I'm currently reading The Wars of Light and Shadow by Johnny Watts, and I've been posting the video along with everyone else who has a channel who's also participating in discussions. So that's been a lot of fun. And yeah, I think I was introduced to the subject explicitly by a video that you made, Angela, almost a year ago now, maybe, no, a few months ago.
I
And
think it was maybe 4 months ago or something like that. Yeah.
oh, I
Yeah.
see. And yeah, I think you were asking if anybody's interested in the discussion, and I said yes because it was off of a Malazan subject, and I did and still want to discuss anything Malazan with anyone who wants to. So
Yeah, but today I would like to widen the discussion actually to
yes, of
perhaps
course.
all forms of fantasy. Yeah, this was the starting point of the topic in a way that I made a video where I'm exploring a little bit, my reaction to the violence in Malazan and why might this be more impactful than other fantasy I'm reading. So that was the starting point in a way, and to say maybe we need to discuss this a little bit more, what this whole thing of violence in fantasy is about. And I thought I might start us off perhaps with an observation, and you can tell me, is this actually correct or not, or do you feel the same? But I have the feeling that especially recently, violence is almost a trend in fantasy literature. I mean, we have a whole genre that is kind of like dealing with this in a more explicit way, like grimdark, but also certain authors that then are either rediscovered as forerunners of the grimdark genre seem to get more traction. Certain authors kind of are very much discussed on BookTube at the moment, like R. Scott Baker with his Second Apocalypse series, or if we look at other media like manga, Berserk seems to be another quite violent manga, but also very popular at the time. So, yeah. Am I correct with this observation that violence is the new trend in fantasy?
I would say myself that violence has always been part of fantasy, but I think you're onto something, because there's a difference perhaps in the way the violence is being presented. You mentioned
Yeah.
grimdark. You mentioned grimdark, and I think that it tends to be the case. This is a generalization. Tends to be the case that grimdark fantasy is more honest about violence in a way. In its portrayal of violence, it is visceral, it is bloody, it is disturbing, and violence should be disturbing. Whereas in older fantasy, I think this is again a generalization, but there's a tendency, I don't know if glorify is the right word, but to perhaps whitewash violence, to ignore the fact that
Yeah.
these are living beings being slaughtered, and to just have a great celebration after the victory, and there's no PTSD, and there's no, and the heroes just march forth triumphantly. And
Mm.
that's not grimdark. Grimdark is all about being, I think, more honest about the violence as it takes place, perhaps portraying it more vividly, and the blood splashing and all of that. But also, I think dealing with the PTSD, dealing with the repercussions, perhaps a bit more as well. So it's a mixed thing. I think, there's a place perhaps for a story that wrestles with violence as a very visceral, real thing. And there is a place for stories that are a little bit more remote, that take a step back and don't necessarily tell you about the intestines spilling out and all of that sort of thing. So, but I think you're right that what we see is more often now than ever before, perhaps a willingness to get down in the dirt and describe the violence in a way that, in a sense, feels more honest to me. And I don't know if that's good or bad necessarily, or it's probably both. So we can talk about that perhaps. I'd love to hear what Varsha thinks, though.
Yeah. What do you think, Varsha? Is it a new thing, or is it just that it's presented differently?
I don't know. I'm not too widely read in the genre, or at least not enough that I know what trends are followed per se. But some of the ones that you mentioned, at least Berserk, I think was published in the 80s, or at least it started being published in the 80s. So I don't know if the trend. It seems like people like reading more, not grimdark, maybe grimdark, and that gets lumped in under the grimdark umbrella. But I think I read some YA books recently where there were some morally gray characters. I think that maybe this is also something I'd like to discuss. How much is the notion of morally gray characters tied to the portrayal of violence? And there was one, I forget the name of the book, but the main character, it was very explicitly mentioned, like it was in a first person perspective, and she would go on and on about how it's okay for her to be bad, and how it's okay for her to do these bad things. And the fact that it's crept into YA and it's a fairly popular book, a lot of the Goodreads reviews appreciated the fact that this is a real heroine who makes selfish decisions and so on. I think potentially means that it is gaining popularity among the readership. I don't know, and that I guess feeds into a cycle which would bring more books about that portray more violence. But yes, I think my data point would be the fact that more YA books feel the need to have some morally gray characters and real, quote unquote real, which I think also maybe is valid for discussion in this topic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think Philip made an interesting point when you were saying that violence has always been part of the genre, but it has been depicted differently. And I would say as well, it might not have been like when you said glorified, but this idea of the hero, and also the hero using violence as justice. Not so violence seems to be more justified in older fantasy. No, I mean, we have this in Tolkien, for example, already, no? That the violence is there to kind like, settle an old dispute or get your own back. And it's seen as a justifiable means in that context. Whereas, newer fantasy also, shows us more of the victim, and not just the one who is enacting the violence. So we get more of the fallout of the violence, I think, in more modern fantasy.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point, Angela, about giving us that side of things. And to me, that really segues into a very important point about all of this, which is that when we talk about violence in literature in general, and fantasy is a one of the more violent genres, I think that's fair to say. There's a lot of violence in fantasy, particularly if you're talking about scale, because okay, there's horror, but horror tends to be on a smaller scale. It's much more, personal, I guess. Whereas fantasy, particularly epic fantasy, there's lots of different kinds of fantasy too. So, but if you're looking at military or epic fantasy, they're just huge armies going at each other and that sort of thing. But the point is, I think we need to ask the question, why is the violence there? Is the author glorifying, or is it somehow spectacle, or is it voyeuristic in some way? Or is the author wrestling with something important? Like, why do human beings do these things? And are we looking at the lead up to the violence, the causes? And are we looking at the repercussions, particularly on the people who suffer from the violence? And the repercussions on the perpetrators of the violence? Because when you commit violence, it changes you as a person. And to have a story where that person just goes on unchanged after committing the violence doesn't feel quite authentic to me. So I guess those are the questions I think that we might want to think about. Why is it there? Are we looking at the causes? Are we looking at the effects?
I think we can find both in kind of like the genre at the moment. Now we can find books that really try to look at the causes and also at the effects of violence, but we can also find books where it's almost like a garnish, no? That's something to sprinkle on top to make it a little bit, I don't know, almost a little bit more juicy, or in the hope it sells better, or whatever the author might have thought at the time. I just finished reading Ursula Le Guin's very first novel, Rocannon's World. And it deals very much with colonialization, but also kind of like genocide. And the violence is almost non-existent. There are some very tame battle scenes at some stage. But we also have, whole villages just eradicated. And it's kind of like, the way she writes it, it's it's a messenger speech. Now somebody comes and tells then other people about it. Now she explores a little bit the fallout of it, because we have one survivor, and it's actually very heart-wrenching not to hear then this survivor who escaped this kind of village that now is pulverized in a way. But otherwise, I think earlier fantasy, as I say, seems to tend to be more on the side of the victors, and justifying that. When we said at the beginning, Melarsen, I think Melarsen is a good example to see how, especially the fallout of violence on both sides for victim and perpetrator is explored.
I would agree with that. And I don't know, Varsha, do you want to make a point before I agree with Angela?
No, go ahead, Philip.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so I would agree with how you just characterized Melarsen. I'm actually finishing up a Le Guin book as well. So I think he's an interesting example, because I'm finishing Tehanu. And I've, in the last few months, have read the first 3 Ursi books. Tehanu is the 4th. And as you said, it's similar with the Ursi books. There is not a lot of violence in her books. In fact, you could say in each book, maybe 1 or 2 incidents of violence. And they're much, in this case, in Ursi, they're very personal. They're very small scale. There are no big military battles or anything like that. And it's interesting, because when these incidents occur, the impact is tremendous. It's because the rest of the story isn't constant action and violence. It's much more, I just think so highly of her writing. It's so beautiful. And I feel like I'm being bathed in wonder and beauty when I read her books. But then these incidents occur, and they're very shocking, and they're very impactful when they happen. And it tends to be just, very small scale, but the impact is tremendous. Much more so, like I remember that incident in an Earthsea book. That'll be just seared into my memory. Whereas an epic fantasy where there's battle after battle, all these things kind of mesh into each other, and I don't necessarily remember as vividly the violence, ironically, from those stories. So it's interesting. That's maybe an interesting lesson for authors to think about, how the violence can really stand out in a story like Le Guin's, where there's less of it. Whereas if you're just doing battle after battle and blood splashing everywhere, it just sort of starts to all blend into each other, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, that's very interesting what you say, because I think as well this incident I was just describing with this lone survivor, I think he will stay with me much more than other violent incidences, no? Because the way he describes it, and also the way his culture worked, because his culture was very much that they had this telepathic thing going on, so they were all interconnected, and everybody kind of like knew what everybody else is thinking and feeling, and now he's all alone, and the result of that is that he's just a husk, no? He's dead inside in a way. And I think that will stay with me much longer than but even like Malazan, no? Malazan, in some respects, some of the battle scenes are becoming a little bit a blur already. No, I'm at the midway point. I've read the first 5 books, but already I would struggle to kind of like recall in more detail battle scenes from earlier books. No?
Yeah. And by the way, too, I want to say, I am not trying to make this sound like a judgment. If an author includes violence as spectacle, and some of my favorite authors do this, George R. Martin, for example, I can pick on him because he's very successful and I admire so many things about his writing. So I'll just pick on George a little bit here.
Okay, go ahead.
I think there is an element of spectacle and voyeurism to his writing, both in terms of violence and sex. And there are so many things I love about his writing. And he's just a brilliant author, and he's successful for good reasons. But I think he's a good example of an author who has that stuff in there. And it's not just either or, by the way. You can have a mixture of spectacle, but also introspection. And I think there are authors like Stephen Erickson, for example, or Robin Hobb, who are really good, and Ursula Le Guin, who are just really are on one end of this possible spectrum, where they're going to look at the repercussions, they're going to look at the causes, they're going to really get into this and explore the humanity of it and the tragedy of it and all of that in depth. And you have other authors like George R. R. Martin, who tends to be more toward the other side, in my opinion, at least, where he doesn't go completely as far into the repercussions. We tend to move on from the violence, and it tends to be there more for its own sake, I think. But it's not that he doesn't ever. It's not that he doesn't ever look at the consequences, because his characters do change in the course of suffering or perpetrating all this violence. But I think it's more of a spectrum. It's not an either or, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I think so too. But I think I would agree that A Song of Ice and Fire definitely has some scenes that I found, I'm reaching my limit. No? And I'm thinking of, for example, the torture scenes with Theon Greyjoy. No? That was where I was like, okay, I don't need another one of those now. No?
Yeah.
Varsha, any examples that come to mind where you would say, well, this handles violence very well, or the opposite, this was so bad?
I think 2 examples come to mind. Angela, I'm not sure if you finished The Curse of the Mistwraith yet, but
I'm still playing catch up with Jenny Woods. I know.
I think the final chapters of that are some of the best. I love how Jenny Woods did the fallout from battle. It was absolutely brilliantly done, and
Yeah.
I cried a lot for people that I didn't have a lot of familiarity with, for characters that I hadn't grown to love, but were just, a fallout from battle. I wept during that chapter. And the second one that comes to mind is Strange the Dreamer. I think it's marketed YA. I kind of disagree with that, but I can. Is it okay if I spoil it a little bit? There is there's a character who's done a violent crime which brought about the release of his people from a lot of oppression, but he feels really guilty about what he's done, and we explore that over the course of 2 books, and I think that that's really well done. It wasn't, and he feels guilty about having these thoughts, for feeling guilty in the first place, because he would do it again because it, released his people from the oppression. But also what his crimes were extremely violent, and he's traumatized about that for a long time. So I thought that was done really well. In general, I think Tori from Tori Talks had an interview with Steven Erikson recently, in which they were discussing writing trauma, and Erikson said that you have to sort of stay with your victim. You can't just leave them after a violent deed is done. And I love how he put that. I think that sort of makes all the difference. Yes, spectacle makes sense, and you may like it or not, and whatever works for a writer or reader does. But for me, the exploration makes sense, and I think that sort of is the crux of whether violence works or feels like necessary or not, right? Whether you're really exploring the consequences.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's really well said, Varsha.
Yeah.
And I think it is the job of literature. It's not the only job. There's a lot of, it can be entertaining as well. That's great. Literature can be just entertaining too. But one of the jobs of literature is to tackle difficult subjects like violence. And I think you gave a great example, Jenny Wirtz's Curse of the Mistwraith. The final quarter of that book is just devastating and so well done. And you walk away with that, with a real sense of the tragedy that results from large scale violence. It's really well done. And I think it's very important to point out that she and other good authors often do look at, as we said earlier, it's not just about, it should be about what happens to the people who suffer the violence, but also what happens to the people who perpetrate it. It's an important thing to explore. I have a character in my book, the first book, who I love this character. And this character thinks of herself as a healer, but she's in a position where she's forced to decide whether or not to use violence. And one of the things I'm interested in her journey is, how does the decision to use violence change that character, and in what ways? That's it's a tough thing, especially given that in my particular world, magic is empathic. So someone in that character's position who has the ability to use magic is going to feel the suffering of other people, even and especially perhaps when she is inflicting that suffering.
I actually like that about the magic in your world, that the fallout is, so to say, already built into the usage of the magic, though you can't use it without kind like having the fallout follow you, no? So if you use it for good, then yes, of course you get the benefits of that. But if you use it for more violent purposes, then you have to deal with that as well. And I find it also interesting that you have characters who just don't care, who go ahead with the violence anyway, even so it makes them suffer themselves a lot. But just saying, I have a certain goal in mind here. That's the means to get there. So I'll suffer through that.
Yeah, because they believe that the goal they're reaching towards is worth any price.
Yeah.
And that the violence is justified because of the ends that they're striving towards. And that is something I think you see repeatedly in human history, is the ways in which we justify our otherizing and our violence. You see it over and over and over again. And this fascinates me and horrifies me in a way. Like, how does a person get to a point where they feel not only justified but right in inflicting pain and suffering on other people? How do you get to that point? Where does that come from? And that's something that literature needs to explore. As difficult as it is sometimes to read, and I don't think you have to read about that all the time. There are other things to explore too, but it's an important thing to look at, I think.
Yeah, I think good literature, I think, tries to deal with overarching, let's say, eternal themes that are there for all of us. So they tries to deal with the condition of humankind as such. And I think violence, of course, is part of that, if we like it or not. Now we have this almost split personality that as humans we can do both. No, we can be good and we can be very evil, violent. No, and I think literature, if it is supposed to speak to us, needs to address this and needs to deal with this in some form or another. As we're talking about the question, can violence be justified? I was thinking kind of like in the run-up to this discussion as well, like, but for example, about war situations, do we feel that violence is more justified there? But also situations of self-defense. Is self-defense even violence? Would we even classify it as violence?
Yeah. Great questions. There is a pacifist response to violence, that is to not react with violence. Violence begets violence, and we've seen that work sometimes in human history. I think of Mahatma Gandhi or Martin Luther King Jr., who both of whom are good examples of individuals, leaders who have used nonviolence very effectively to achieve justice. So it is doable, but the question always goes back to things like, well, what about World War II? What if we just sort of let that happen? What if we let the Nazis do whatever they wanted, because violence, even against violence, is bad? And that's a tough one. That's a really tough one.
It's a very tough one indeed. Yeah. But also, especially as you mentioned World War II, the fallout of this can, of course, be a reaction of, like you say, a pacifist stance. No, I'm coming from a family, for example, my father is very pacifistic in his outlook, and it has to do with this experience that his father was a soldier in the Second World War, and he didn't want this to be repeated. No, and we as children. Guns as toys were totally a no-no, but even kind like playing stuff like cowboys and Indians or something like that. No, you better not get caught by daddy, because that wouldn't go down very well. No, so I think it can go both ways. No.
Yeah. Varsha, did you have any thoughts on pacifism? And is there, this is something that I think you explore in fantasy. And certainly I try to, in that character I mentioned in my book, is she makes the decision to use power and violence to combat aggression and violence. And that changes her. You're not going to emerge from that experience unchanged. So there are consequences to using violence to counter violence. And of course, there are consequences to being a pacifist as well. And so I don't know, what do you have any thoughts on all of this, Varsha?
Yeah, I think I don't know that I can equivocally say there are no situations where violence is justified. Like, you brought up some good examples. But also, I don't think pacifism necessarily means not doing anything. It just means reacting differently. Like, we studied a lot of the independence movement in school and history. So there was with satyagraha, right? It's a non-cooperation movement and refusing to like burning or refusing to use British-made goods. Like there's a lot of like small things that brought about change. But then, there were, again, in the same movement, there were people who said, no, this is moving things slowly. We need to also engage in violence to make things move faster. And I think ultimately both helped. In just using the example of my country as an example, I guess, we both ultimately were what contributed. And you can't say that one versus the other would have done any better. But yeah, pacifism isn't letting things happen. It's finding ways that are not violent to stop things from happening, which there are good examples. But ultimately Mahatma Gandhi was shot. Was he? I think he was shot. Yeah, so it may not always work. You may not, and you also have to convince large groups of people. It's not enough for one person to believe that, right? It's easier to convince people to engage in violence than it is to convince large groups of people to say, no, let's just do a fast until death. Yeah, I think my point is that I really appreciate and understand the pacifist means, but they may not always work in a pinch. There may be situations where we need to do otherwise, probably.
I find this an interesting point when you said that Gandhi was shot. No, so violence seems to be linked into a lot of different areas. So one could argue that he basically sacrificed himself in some respects. No? And we have this, as we mentioned, Malasan before. Now we have several figures in Malasan who sacrificed themselves. No?
Yeah.
To either end suffering or prevent suffering in the first place.
Yeah. Allowing violence to be perpetrated on themselves. Yeah. And of course, Martin Luther King Jr. was also shot.
Yeah, it's another example, yeah.
And that's another movement where you had people like him advocating nonviolent means of combating racism, and but you also had people like Malcolm X and many others, who were more willing to entertain more violent means of combating the injustices that they were trying to change. So, yeah, and I think fantasy is a great genre for exploring all of this. So it is something that is, I want to say, is a legitimate thing to be looking at. And I don't know that I handle it perfectly as a writer. I try to look at causes. I try to explore the effects on the various actors and the people being acted upon. And that is something that, it's a trilogy. So I do it even the most actually in the third book, really. But it's how do you do it responsibly? Some people are going to have a different perspective on that, I think, than others. All you can do as an author is to do your best, I think. But there's an array out there, and I'm not going to be the person at all to say, this is how you should do it, and this is bad. This is a bad way to do it. There's just there's a lot of reasons for storytelling, and I don't. Yeah. That said, is it ever problematic to have violence in a book where it's glorified? Yes, absolutely. I can imagine a book written that glorifies violence, that otherizes somebody or a group of people and makes it seem like they're just all evil and bad, and the people who perpetrate the violence are just good. That becomes basically a propaganda, right?
Yeah.
Very irresponsible, reprehensible inclusion of violence in that case. So there are examples, I think, of poor or bad use of violence.
Yeah, I think it would be very hard to kind of like draw up a rule book of how to handle violence, not kind of like a writer's how-to almost, because as I kind of like make clear in that video I did about malignant violence, violence is very subjective, how we experience it, how we react to it, but then also what is classified as violence is of course dependent on our cultural background, our historical background, even socio-economic things like gender. No, they all play a role in how we experience it and how we classify it. No? So I think it might almost be impossible to find this. Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, violence is seem to be universal. No, seems to be part and parcel of the human condition, no matter where we are as humans culturally. But then on the other hand, how we react to it seems to be very culturally determined. And I think that makes it perhaps almost impossible to, find some type of, universal rules that we could apply then to say, well, this is a good example for violence and this is a bad example for violence.
Yeah. Thoughts on that, Varsha?
I was thinking it goes back to the question about whether there is any violence that is justified. And I'm sure everybody has a different opinion on specific violence being justified or not. So, whatever, I know different people have, so there's depiction and there's exploration of violence, right? The spectacle versus exploring the consequences that we discussed earlier. And I think we might, as readers, we might interpret it as one or the other depending on tolerance levels. So it might be that the author is doing an exploration, but I know many people are resistant to some of the themes explored in Malazan, for instance. Whereas I don't think there is, I haven't finished the series yet, but in the 8 books so far, there's no case that I felt like, this was unnecessary or, something that I disagreed with is being told to me is an okay form of violence, for instance. But I know there are readers who are like, why the hell am I reading about this in this book? Why does this need to be written about in so much gory detail? So I think really, it comes down to the tolerance levels of people, like what they consider justified or not, and whether or not they feel that the exploration is treated as justification of the violence or not, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. The booktuber Criminoli had actually a very interesting video on his channel with the title "Why Read Disturbing Books?" And he gives horror as one example, and he says horror is kind of like almost as if it's training our fight and flight response. It's like riding roller coasters as well. No? So you're scared, but being scared is a good thing because it kind of like is necessary for survival. Whereas he says disturbing books would work differently, that they're more like an endurance test. Kind of like, so how far can I be pushed as a reader? But also kind of like leaving control to the reader, because the reader can, of course, withdraw from the disturbing aspects at any time. Now we can just close the book and walk away, which in real life, of course, isn't possible. No? So can we say that one of the functions of violence in literature is, perhaps to kind of present those test cases to us?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there's look, we human beings are fascinated by violence. When you're driving on the highway and there's an accident, it's difficult not to rubberneck and look at, oh my goodness, we're fascinated. There might be an evolutionary thing behind that. Like, okay, don't do that. And it's really, it's sort of
don't do that, but also check out what happened so that it won't get you. No, I mean, when we were still in the savannah, if you see a kind of like a flock of lions kind of like gathering around something,
Yeah.
You might want to run the other way, no? So kind of like make sure that this will not happen to you, perhaps as well.
That's right. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah. And I would have been
yeah.
weeded out because I'm very nearsighted. So I would have been.
Yeah, me too. I wouldn't have had a chance.
Everybody else is running, and I'm like, what is that?
I would have to hog the line to know what's going on.
So they didn't have glasses in the savannah.
No.
I mean,
yeah. They wouldn't have had any.
Of course, I would be dessert. That's it.
I think most of us booktubers would not have made it.
No, probably not. No.
But
at least I'm good at running, so I mean.
So one facet of violence that we haven't talked about explicitly yet, but it deserves its own, I think, discussion in a way, is sexual violence.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
how that gets portrayed. And once again, I do believe that literature can and should tackle this very difficult topic. But as a male, I think very conscious of the fact that this is something, if I decided was important enough for me to try to tackle, I would have to be extremely careful in the way I do it. And you know, again, there are authors I think who handle this really well. Robin Hobb is a great example of an author who really looks at it and the repercussions and what led up to it and everything in a way that I found very compelling, very cathartic, and very moving. And she does a thorough job of looking at it. But yeah, it is something that comes up a lot. Again, in perhaps especially fantasy, you do have a lot of sexual violence. And again, I think there was a time when it was, and this is a gross generalization, but I think there's a time in maybe older fantasy where it's glossed over, perhaps, or it's not looking at the consequences so much, or it even completely ignoring what's happening to the person that the violence is used against. And again, we don't see so, or it's used in like fridging or something like that, you know, where it's a way to make the male hero look, you know, heroic, that sort of thing. So. As painful as it is for us to look at this, I think it's important to look at it in a more realistic way sometimes. But again, as a male, it's something that I'm very wary of doing, particularly. So that's just me.
Yeah. Varsha, what about you? Do you find that a difficult form of violence, sexual violence?
Yeah, I certainly find it difficult to read. What bothers me most is, again, if there is no exploration, if it's just done and we move on from it. And there was one book I read, again, I don't remember the name, sorry, but that had a character be raped at the very beginning of the book. And then she went off adventuring and we never had a thought about it afterwards. So I failed to see the purpose of that. So I think, I agree with what you said, Philip, that so first, I don't know how, I need to think about how I feel about the presence of sexual violence in books at all. For battle scenes and other things, when there is reasonable exploration of it, I'd argue that the purpose of it is to sensitize readers that, you know, wars have consequences. For instance, there's lessons to be learned there. But with sexual violence, the need for exploration, I think the purpose would be maybe for victims to feel seen, perhaps. I don't know if I can think of any other reasons for it. And maybe if potential perpetrators need to be sensitized, perhaps that is a potential goal. But or, you know, I guess in some cultures where just generalized groping of women is considered okay, and you have to cover yourself up. I grew up in a place like that. It's maybe, it's or even, I guess, the Me Too movement. There's, it's considered normal to not be respectful of a person's personal space, right? So maybe it can potentially sensitize people like that. Sorry, I think this was just me thinking out loud about why we might need to explore sexual violence in a book. But yeah, I guess those are all arguments for why it might be okay to even explore it as a subject, to sensitize potential people, potential perpetrators perhaps, but maybe also so the victims feel seen. But I might potentially make a case that we don't need to read about it that much. I'm not convinced that it's necessary to write about it or read about it. But if it's present, I need it to be properly exploring the consequences on the victims.
Yeah, I think for myself, when I find it really problematic is if it just, how shall I say, perpetuates kind like the stereotypes that we have about rape and rape victims in our societies. No? If it's a case of, yeah, sure, they're asking for it, this type of argument, that's when I'm kind of like, yeah, okay, goodbye, no, you lost me. And I would say as well, yeah, if we should explore it, yes, because it's a feature of our world. No, it happens. By the way, it also happens to men. It does not just happen to women. No, so we should make that clear as well. And yeah, I think it's best handled if authors are able to kind of like, yeah, I wouldn't say a meta level, but have some type of reflective exploration, and also, like Varsha says, make sure that the victim side is explored and the trauma of it is actually explored as well and given a voice in some respects. And yeah, there are good examples and yeah, not so good examples. And unfortunately, there are also sometimes women who kind of like yeah, perpetuate those stereotypes in their books. No,
Sure. Yeah, it's not only the men who can handle it badly.
no, not at all. No, I mean, this was one of the problems I had with reading Sarah Maas. Not so much that it was more like a popcorn read. No, I mean, that's perfectly okay. Sometimes you just want a popcorn read. But this idea that women, and especially intelligent women, should dumb down to appeal to men. No? And I was like, no, excuse me, no. Sorry, Sarah, it's 2023, no, something must have bypassed you there. So,
Yeah.
and the same I think goes for sexual violence in books, no, that if it kind of like just gives me this more outmoded model almost, that yeah, I think we don't need this in today's modern fantasy. I mean, it's different with historical examples, but yeah. Does it matter actually to you, both of you, who is the perpetrator and like the gender or sex of who is the rapist and who gets raped, or does that not matter?
I think it matters. The fact is that, yes, you're absolutely right that men can be victims of sexual violence and that women can be perpetrators of sexual violence. But I think the statistics would bear out that the vast majority of perpetrators of sexual violence are male. That's the truth. So that matters. I don't think we should just ignore that. But that said, this is something that has many facets to it, and yeah,
I would say as well, we almost would need a separate second discussion on just that aspect, no?
Yes.
Because also like men and women can be both perpetrators and victims. The same, of course, goes for readers. It's not kind like that all male readers automatically are indifferent to those types of scenes in books. No,
Right.
they can be equally impacted as female readers can be. So I think
Yes.
that's something as well that should be kept in mind, perhaps,
Absolutely.
when we think about that.
Yeah.
Yeah. What about kind like violence against animals? Is that again different, or?
I actually will often experience that as worse than violence against
Yeah.
humans. Maybe it's because I feel that animals are somehow more innocent than most people. But yeah, no, I feel like the most violent species on this planet by far, and it's not even close, is humans.
Yeah.
We don't even have a close second place, I think. And so in terms of just sheer numbers of other creatures that we've caused the extinction of, or the ways in which we exploit other creatures, this is our right. This is what we, without even a moment's thought of the repercussions, not only on those other creatures, but on ourselves. We've destroyed a lot of things. So I tend to be more sympathetic in a way toward animals than humans. Maybe some people think I'm crazy for that, but that's how I feel.
Yeah, no. Varsha, what about you? Is it more impactful if it's animals than humans?
Maybe. I think that makes me more angry than other forms of violence. I think one example that comes to mind is Temeraire by Naomi Novik, in which there are talking dragons and humans are dragon riders. And some of the dragon riders abuse their dragons by not taking care of them, and the dragons like yearning for affection from the master. And that made me angry, I guess, because especially because this dragon can talk and tell us how it feels.
Yeah.
So yeah, I see. I think I see what you mean, Philip. I haven't explicitly thought about it until now, but I think I feel more anger in those situations than I guess horrified as I would be in the case of like human on human violence.
Yeah, I would say as well, it's not crazy that you say that it might be even more impactful. I was reminded of this scene in, I think it's Red Sister, when they,
Oh,
the scene with the donkey. Yeah. Oh,
yes.
yeah.
Oh
Yeah. No,
gosh.
yeah. And I think the reason why it's so terrible is, well, you said they're innocent, and also, I wouldn't say that animals are deliberately violent. No, there is
Yeah.
no kind like it's not planned or anything. No, if an animal gets violent, then it's mostly in defending itself or to hunt and to
Yeah.
feed itself. No, so I think that's a huge difference between violence that humans commit and violence in animals. And maybe that's why I think as well it impacts me sometimes more to see violence against animals. Also, yeah, not only are we the most perhaps violent species on earth, we also have kind of like, when it comes to most animals, definitely the upper hand. No, I mean, we are capable of killing any other life form on this planet. No, so and that's kind of like, yeah, that the power dynamics is, I think, very, very different if it's a human versus an animal, as if it's kind of like humans against each other. I think there is that aspect of it as well. And the other thing, and I think this is where I think fantasy is probably really at an advantage, because a lot of the time we do not think of animals as sentient beings. You know?
Hmm.
Whereas in fantasy, we can have sentient animals who have the capacity, for example, also of human speech, no? Which then kind of like impacts us again in a different way, I think.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's wonderful, and Varsha touched on this earlier, is the capacity of literature in general, and I think fantasy has some very special ways of doing it,
Mm,
of creating empathy,
yeah.
and it's wonderful.
Yeah.
It is a very important function of storytelling, and
Mm,
fantasy has some really cool ways that it can go about doing this that are unique to the genre. So it's important, once again, to explore this. And yeah, I mean, it's when when I read a book with an animal companion, my usual thought is, okay, you can kill anyone you want, but please
exactly.
don't touch the animal companion.
Exactly. Yeah. That's sacred. Don't go there.
Yeah,
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
don't pull an
Yeah.
old yeller on me here now.
No. Mm.
That's less justifiable, or it's less easy to rationalize as, like, being on one side or the other. No, for violence against animals, you can't rationalize it as the other side did this, so that's why they deserve that. So
Mm.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, Something else that occurred to me is kind of like, is violence and cruelty, are they the same thing or are they different things? I mean, we have two different words for it, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they mean different things.
That's a
What does
great
the English
question.
professor have to say?
Well, I think another word that we should bring into the conversation is power.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Yeah.
cruelty is perhaps the perpetrating of violence with a kind of repulsive enjoyment of it because of the
Mm.
power that you gain over the victim.
Yeah.
I think that cruelty has that element of power where the perpetrator, and it's a sickness, it really is, but where there's an enjoyment of that power that one has over the other.
Mm.
And that's a big part of sexual violence as well, I think, too.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so maybe I would make that distinction. And then so it's good that we have these separate words to
Mm.
allow us to think through what's behind this. And I think that and you look at often people who do perpetrate cruelty on others, and they are people who are disempowered often in some ways, not always, and there are people who are very privileged who
Mm.
just are sadistic people who enjoy that power they have over others in a very sick way. But sometimes it is the case where you have someone who is disempowered in some ways and is trying to compensate for that by asserting power over someone else in a way that is cruel. I think a lot of the casual violence you see in the world is a result of that dynamic.
Mm. Yeah. Varsha, what do you think is violence, cruelty? Is there a difference? And if so, what?
I think I agree with what Philip said. I was going to add to it by asking you both about mental abuse or emotional
Mm.
abuse,
Yeah.
because I think that is tied to the subject of cruelty as well. I don't know that a lot of fantasy explores mental or emotional abuse, but do you know of any examples? I'm sure there are some in Malazan that I don't
Uh,
seem to be able to recall at the moment, but there might be others. Sorry, one second. Invaders in my room. I'm just going to turn off my camera for a bit.
No problem.
yeah.
Yeah, it's a good question of
Mm.
mental abuse, and I can again. I'm going back to Robin Hobb. I definitely in Live Ship Traders. I think is a good example where you see that sort of thing going on,
Mm.
where
I
there's
haven't read that, so
yeah, I'm not going to be specific, but manipulation and that kind of cruelty. And so, yeah, I think you're right, Varsha, that it is a form of violence. That one person, and again, power is very much involved in this kind of situation. I think it is an enjoyment of
yeah.
power over someone else, which is, again, I think it's a kind of disturbing type of sickness in someone.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of an example, but as always, now if you want an example, you can't find any. But I would definitely agree that fantasy literature seems to be more preoccupied with physical violence than psychological or mental violence. Yeah, I would agree with that definitely. Also, I found interesting what Philip was saying earlier about this kind of cruelty. First of all, that it's kind of like almost violence as a means to gratification, and we see this especially then in sexual violence as well. But also that it can be a reaction, kind of like somebody who does not have power as such, then, and kind of having this feeling that if they are cruel or violent, that they then kind of like get at least some part of control or some part of power. And I found that an interesting thought, because for my Malasan video, I used the framework of an American psychologist, Eric Emerson, and his idea of challenging behaviors. And one of the points he makes, for example, is that challenging behaviors can be also adaptive behaviors. So they can be a reaction to the environment or to other people then, of course, as well. And I found that, definitely a very interesting thought as well, because I think we have the tendency to see the power dynamics in violent situations as very clear cut. That we always think that the perpetrator is automatically also the powerful element in that equation.
Yeah. And I think the power aspect of this is one reason why males are overrepresented in all forms of violence and sexual violence.
Yeah.
Because in many societies, very patriarchal societies especially, males are taught that to be a real man, you have to be powerful. And I think a lot of men who don't feel so powerful try to find ways to empower themselves. And often that takes the form of violence and disempowering someone else. So that is one reason why I believe that males are more often than not the perpetrators of violence.
That, and also that, like, men are taught that they have to be powerful, and women are taught that they have to be pleasing to men.
Yeah.
And that, of course, is in, or can be in some circumstances, a really toxic combination then. And I found it very interesting, like I think Varsha mentioned the Me Too movement earlier, that when this surfaced, that one of the big demands was we have to educate men differently, or we have to raise our boys differently so that they grow not into this toxic masculinity. And I would say, that's just one half. No, we also have to raise girls differently, that they're not kind of like just those, that it's not their fallback position to be meek and thinking about kind of like, oh, if I assert myself, then I might not be pleasing anymore. So I think there, again, it seems to be very, very complex in a way.
Yep.
Yeah. Fascinating. Fascinating.
It's a big subject.
It is, isn't it?
I feel like we're scratching the surface.
Oh yeah, just about. Like, as I say, violence seems to be connected to so many other aspects of our life in a way, no?
Yeah.
That's It's amazing in some respects. But then also perhaps not so surprising that it's giving so much room in literature and then fantasy literature as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it belongs there. And certainly, there's a range. You will find authors like Le Guin on the one hand who don't include a ton of violence in their writing, in their fantasy, and others who definitely include a lot more. And I would never say one or the other is right or wrong, but there is, I think, as I said before, that spectrum of, and it's something for writers to think about, perhaps, if they want to do more than just entertain, and they want to think, help the readers work through real world issues and things like that, then it is something that is certainly worthy of exploration.
Would you think that there are themes in literature that could be enhanced by violence or by the inclusion of violence?
I think so. In my book, I'm trying to explore the ways in which one culture justifies its self perceived superiority over another.
Yeah.
And that is usually enacted through violence, through colonization, through war. So that's definitely something I'm trying to do. Yeah. So I would definitely say yes to that question.
Varsha, as a reader, do you think that there are themes that, that are enhanced by the inclusion of violence?
I think so, yes. I know the term hard hitting gets thrown around a lot, and especially in the context of grimdark fantasy or just grimdark in general. But I think some things just have more of an impact if you stay longer with the victim, or if you look at the violence in some detail. And again, I think the interpretation of it as voyeuristic versus necessary depends on the reader. But there could be things that serve more to sensitize if we see the consequences in detail.
Yeah. What about, you mentioned grimdark, and one of the features of grimdark is, of course, kind of like this very nihilistic worldview. And there are positions that say that, like in an inherently meaningless world, that violence, because it's so visceral, is perhaps the only thing that might actually provide meaning. Is that? I personally think it's a very extreme position.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's something that does get portrayed sometimes in some books, and that we call grimdark. I don't think it's the only way that characters in a largely existentialist world can carve meaning from the world, and the word "carve" is kind of a violent word as well. It's not necessarily through violence. There are lots of ways of asserting meaning for oneself, but it tends to be the case that, and Stephen Donaldson in his essays on epic fantasy argued that a lot of the action violence that we see enacted in the story is often in some sense or other metaphorical for internal struggle. That it could be seen as a reflection of that as well, of me just trying to find my own meaning and pull my own meaning from this existence, which is continuously trying to tell me how absurd I am.
I try to find or to think of a fantasy author actually who kind of like has this position. Couldn't somehow, the only author that surfaced was Hemingway. Hemingway, I think, is very much in this. Of course, he's known for his very macho stance, no? But also kind of like this idea that, violence is perhaps the only thing that gives meaning to life. No.
struggle
Or
anyway.
sex,
Yeah.
I think, seems to oscillate between those two.
Yeah.
Yeah. Varsha, any thoughts on that? Or
I'm trying to think. I don't have a lot of experience reading grimdark, but I'm curious. I want to go back to something you said a little bit earlier, Angela.
yeah,
You,
sure.
the example you gave about the purpose of reading violence is to build endurance. I
Yeah,
want
that
to understand that a bit
disturbing
more.
things is an endurance test. Yeah.
Is it so for me, meaningful use of violence is to sensitize readers about certain subjects, right?
Yeah.
But endurance sounds like the purpose is to desensitize and shove more in your face and say, are you okay with this? Are you okay with this if I worsen it a bit more? And I haven't read a lot of grimdark, but it feels like some grimdark might do that. Is that true? And if so, I guess, what is your opinion on it? Do you think it desensitizes from violence, or does it still feel like
Yeah.
it touches upon sensitization?
Yeah, I wouldn't say necessarily desensitize it, but if I see violence in fantasy or in literature in general as this model of endurance tests, no, maybe it's also raising awareness where for myself, where are my own boundaries as a reader. No, I don't think that necessarily automatically desensitizes, but would perhaps, depend very much on the type of reader. No? Does the reader want to engage in this type of self-exploration or not? And I think that was one of the things I'm ending my video on Malasen with, that I say that Malasen is an invitation for self-exploration, and it's up to the reader if we take the author up on this or not. And if we do, we might find that the most violent corners are actually inside us. No, so I think it can go both ways. It can desensitize if the reader doesn't want to reflect any further and just reads it and just glosses over it. I thought also it could desensitize if the author. That brings us perhaps back again to this question, kind of like, now, when is it well written and when is it not so well written? But I think it would desensitize if we just get one example of violence after another without any kind of like reflective bits in between, and also kind of like no reflection on the fallout either for the perpetrator or for the victim. Now, in that type of writing, we probably would have this feeling of, after a while it doesn't matter anymore. But I think it's a very interesting point, because it's an argument that has been made a long time ago, kind of like in the 18th century already, with the Marquis de Sade in his book, The 100 Days of, what's it called? Anyway, the point he's making in this book is because he has people who meet in this sprawling castle for a 100-day orgy where they kind of like engage in any sexual perversion or deviation that humans can think up. And one of the characters actually makes this interesting point in saying, after a while, it's just boring. It's boredom, not because it's so oversaturated. And so I think on the one hand, you can be right then when you say, that can happen if we have this constant onslaught of violence. And then, on another level, I think it's then up to our own responsibility. How do we want to engage with the material?
Yeah.
No?
I think I've possibly related subject. I know people like to see morally gray characters because they think it's more representative of the real world. And I think I could be wrong about this, but Grimdark is famous for morally gray characters, right? So I think I like reading books with morally gray characters, but I also think that fiction needs to elevate for me. So I want to read about good people who do good things, who might
Yeah.
have to make mistakes and do things we don't agree with, but their purpose and reason is always something that I can agree with. But for morally gray characters, like, people tend to relate to them more, so I guess, what's the role of morally gray characters in violence and fantasy is a question that
Yeah. I mean, the morally gray character at the moment seems to be, very much on trend. No, it's almost a demand that we do want to have morally gray characters. But then again, I think what's gray really depends very much again on cultural, historical, and other factors. No, because my morals are definitely very much the morals of a woman who grew up in a, very industrialized first world Western country, as opposed to somebody who comes from a very different part of the world. So my morally gray character can be perceived as something very different, I think, by somebody else.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a great point. Like, morals are subjective-ish, and so
very much so, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a whole debate right there too.
Yeah, another one. Yeah.
But it is interesting how, in general, I think, as we've in Western societies, particularly perhaps as we've gone from a more, let's say, culturally enforced set of morals that for much of our history was centered around our religion, into, as the centuries passed by, a fragmentation of that, and a lots of different challengers, in a sense, of different moral codes or recognition of different perspectives, and we get into the 20th century where it's just there's no one single entity any longer like you had in medieval times. You had the church, which told people what was right and wrong, and you didn't really have to you didn't have much voice in that, as an individual. And so I think that literature, as it has evolved, reflects that fragmentation. It reflects that lack of a monolithic moral code, and it's just kind of eventually, with existentialism, a sense that there is no inherent meaning, and so that's something we very much see reflected in fantasy. I think that's what grimdark is largely about, honestly. I don't think grimdark is necessarily about violence. I don't think it's necessarily about morally gray characters, except in the sense that morally gray characters reflect the state of our current world, which is a world where there's no single explanation for everything, in a world where a lot of people don't feel there's an inherent sense of meaning to the life in this universe. So there's I think literature does reflect the times that it comes from in many respects. And so grimdark is definitely, I feel, fantasy's answer to a lot of what a lot of writers were writing about even in the early 20th century. And you can find grim, dark-ish things about even some fantasy back then. Sword and Sorcery, for example. It has a lot of things in common with grimdark, actually, I think. So yeah, literature reflects life, and what we're going through. And I think there's a sense that we'd have a less coherent explanation for the universe than we used to have.
Yeah. Or, I mean, you said the Middle Ages and kind of like the dominance of the church. But even that is already fractured, isn't it?
So true.
Yeah, no. So, and I don't know. I mean, you're the medievalist. Do you think it's already then also kind of like reflected in that literature?
It is. I mean, if you look at the Canterbury Tales, for example, in the 14th century, when there was a lot of proto-Protestantism going on. You had people like Wycliffe who wanted to translate the Bible into vernacular languages, and so you had a lot of things, and a broad recognition of. You had two different popes, trying to claim legitimacy, and so you had, certainly I mean, it's not that the Middle Ages was as simple as we often pretend.
Also kind like different religions. No, you have the othering of Jews in the Middle Ages.
Oh my goodness, yeah.
The othering of Muslims, the Crusades,
Yep.
who are another very violent affair, of course.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
Yep. That's very true. I think more and more we recognize that complexity has been around and always has been, but perhaps there's a perception that certain eras have a more coherent or dominant, let's say, the dominance of the institutions is less questioned, perhaps during certain periods than in others.
And in hindsight, of course, kind of like the glorification of certain eras, especially the Middle Ages, and especially for fantasy writers. That's the golden age almost. This yearning to go back to those stories as well. At least in some developments of the genre.
Yeah, going back to a time when there was more certainty. The idea that fantasy as a modern genre developed in the 19th century as a reaction against industrialism, against capitalism, which were systems and developments that fragmented society. And you're absolutely right. There's a yearning to go back to a more coherent social system and way of seeing the life, and a more communal existence, even if it's hierarchical, at least. And this is totally idealized, but there was this thought that everybody took care of each other. Everyone knew each other's, their families were part of the same village for generations, and they were organically connected to this place, and everything was just hunky dory. That's a narrative, anyway.
I don't know. Any other thoughts on violence?
I think we did pretty well. We took a good stab at it, to use a very bad metaphor. We took a good stab at it.
I would say so as well. Varsha, any other thoughts, last thoughts?
No, I think we covered quite a wide gamut of subjects. This is a fun discussion. Yes.
It was a great discussion. So thank you to the two of you for joining me in this and trying to explore a little bit more what violence is about, and how violence kind of like impacts us, and why we I think we all agree that we do need it in fantasy and in literature in general. So thank you, and goodbye, I presume.
Well, before we go, I also want to thank you, Angela, for organizing this discussion, for hosting it, for being such a wonderful host. And just you bring a lot to our community. So I'm very, very happy to have been part of this discussion. And also you, Varsha, thank you so much for being part of this. I've always enjoyed our interactions. So it's really great to hear your thoughts too.
Thank you so much.
I have to say as well, I enjoy. Go ahead.
No, I was saying go ahead. Sorry.
No, I think it's also important that we had kind of different views, also from different cultural backgrounds as well. No? So, I mean, it's too important a topic that kind of like just, how shall I say, one sort of smarties should sit here and discuss this. No? So, yeah. Thank you. And thank you to everybody who will be viewing this in the future. So thank you and goodbye to everybody.